Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin day 5 of our 10-day program covering the Conference of Parties, number 27, that's taking place as we speak in Sharm El Sheikh. As it turns out, literally now, President Joe Biden of the United States is giving his address to the conference. Many heads of state are there. Activists from around the world, and of course, oil industry lobbyists are also there in yet another conference of parties over the past 27 years that have succeeded in accomplishing very little, if anything at all, to remedy the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced with runaway global warming, the consequence of which is a radical destabilization of our climate and the destabilization of our ecological order within which humanity and all living beings have their place and live out their lives. So this is a very serious moment, and Humanity Rising, as we've done each year, dedicates the time that the world is focusing on climate to focus in our own way. I think the world progressive movement and climate movement concluded at the end of COP26 that it was no longer possible to hold out really any hope that the governments were actually going to do anything. And so it is now up to us, the people, to understand that and to take the kind of actions that are required to save humanity from itself as we teeter quite literally on the brink of self-destruction. There are right now over 1 million species facing extinction, and the human race is one of them, and we need to take that extremely seriously. So each day we've been beaming in from Sharm El Sheikh with Facing Future TV. We've also been convening each day young people around the world through Oz Green and Youth Leading the World that are dedicated their lives to climate activism. And it's been an inspiration, like we heard yesterday from Vandana Shiva, that there's extraordinary amount of good work being done almost everywhere. And that's where we want to keep our focus, not on the governments, not on the corporate sector, but what we, the people, can be doing. We're wanting to dive into our program. Over the last couple of days, we haven't gotten to our coherence breathing as we always do with Humanity Rising because of the hustle and bustle of Sharm El Sheikh and time zones and young people in Sierra Leone. But we want to just pause and just take a moment to breathe together as breath-breathing human beings, as Rumi puts it, to center ourselves in the coherence that we need to maintain our equilibrium and to navigate an increasingly hyper-complex world. For those of you who are new and watching Humanity Rising for the first time, we do a very simple breathing technique. You'll hear the sound of a bell and just breathe in for about 5.5 seconds. You hear another bell and just breathe out for about 5.5 seconds. And that means that you're breathing 5.5 times a minute and bringing in 5.5 liters of air. And according to ancient mystical awareness and modern science, this kind of coherent breathing is probably the most effective way to bring not only coherence to your whole body, but an optimization of your equilibrium and calm and your mental acuity all at the same time. You'll see an art card of a 5-pointed star that we put up, and this is what the orbital pathway of Earth and Venus is, what they look like as they circumambulate the sun on their annual journey and their orbits. So thank you, everyone. Let us breathe together, and then we'll embark on our program. Thank you, everyone. It's always so good to breathe together in the awareness, as Plotinus observed several thousand years ago, that the whole universe breathes as one. I want to note that today, on November 11th, is the day since the ending of the First World War, where the European powers and the United States pause and just commemorate those who fell during the First World War, those, as the practice was continued, who fell in the Second World War. This is a time where we all just take note of the scourge of war, the pointlessness of war, particularly as we witness today the war in the Ukraine and other wars and conflicts that are taking place around the world. Of all the human activities, war is the most destructive, dysfunctional, pointless, counterproductive, and absurd. That human beings who all look basically the same, breathe the same, think the same, feel the same, and yet are diverse in custom, language, and belief, that can't get along and simply respect one another and live harmoniously with all our diversity, like the colors of the rainbow. War is a signal of our inability to recognize the most obvious thing in the world, that we're one species and should be living in peace. It's my pleasure now to introduce someone who's become a good friend and colleague, Rupert Read. He was part of our proceedings last year when we covered the COP26 in Glasgow. He's one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. He has moved on from that and has really focused himself on what he calls the moderate flank and transformative adaptation. He's a scholar, teaches at the University of East Anglia. He is an author and has come out with 2 books that we'll be talking about since the COP26 in Glasgow last year, and is one of the leading, I would say, public intellectuals in the climate movement and in the larger movement of how we engage in social transformation to continue to refine the instrumentality of governance and social policy as we seek to make for a better world. So Rupert, thank you for joining us today. He's coming in from England, and I welcome you to Humanity Rising. If you could turn on your video.
I'm not allowed to turn it on. You guys need to turn it on.
Oh my goodness.
There we go. I can turn it on now.
Right. There we go.
Thanks, Jim.
Hello, my friend.
Thanks for those beautiful words. Thanks for that super introduction. It's wonderful to be back here again. It's a year since I was with you in those frenetic times from the streets of Glasgow in COP26.
And you came down with COVID, if I recall.
And then I came down with COVID, that's right. And which was incredibly ironic. Yeah. And now here we are, of course, a year later. These COPs keep on coming around every year. It's been 26 times they've come around now. We're on COP27. And, well, we're facing another year of record carbon emissions around the world. So something is not totally working in the COP system, as you implied earlier.
So tell us, let's start with COP26. And you were the one that really called it, and we're very definitive that by now, after 26 years of blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg has so aptly described it, it's time for the world to conclude that the governments are simply not going to solve this problem. Subsequently, you wrote 2 books. So just catch us up on your thinking. I know you wrote your book, Why Climate Breakdown Matters, in the immediate aftermath of COP26. So just share with us your thinking and why you wrote the book and what was the essential message.
Yeah, so Why Climate Breakdown Matters. Well, you might think it's a bit obvious why it matters. It's a book that I wrote to really dive deeply into the philosophy, the spirituality of our situation, to try to help people to understand why the very things that are terrible about our situation are the very things that might get us through. That's what's exciting, I think, about this book. I've just put it in the chat for those who have access to the chat. That the disasters that we're starting to experience could actually bring us together. That the very painful emotions of climate grief and eco-anxiety and so forth that people are quite rightly feeling, those contain an energy which can be transmuted into action, and is all based in love. These are the kinds of themes I pursue in this book, how the terrible downside of what we are experiencing can transmute into a wonderful upside. And I think in that way, I think this book will be very much appreciated, I would hope, by a lot of Humanity Rising listeners and viewers. I think that this is exactly the kind of territory of spiritual transformation and of civilizational transformation as well, that you try to bring. So I'm delighted to share that here. I will show you what the cover looks like. It's a rather marvelous work of art, which the artist very kindly made available to me. It's these two whales, and you probably can't see from the distance here, but the whales are chopped up into the pieces. The first one is chopped up into lubricant, detergent, margarine, oil, ink, etc. So you get the idea there. And the second one is chopped up into global warming, pollution, whale overharvesting, plastics, etc. And so you get the idea there. Yeah, I discuss whales and dolphins in the book also, and discuss how I believe that we can and should learn from them, how they literally have something to teach us about how we can get through this epochal crisis in the way that they have, if you will, a kind of community spirit and a kind of mutual interpenetration that we are trying to reattain. And then, if I may, I will also flash the other book, because I'm so excited about this. I literally got this hot off the press this week. This is Do You Want to Know the Truth? The Surprising Rewards of Climate Breakdown. Again, a fairly striking cover image. Can you see that? It's
yeah.
a man chopping a tree down, and the tree as it falls smashes through the sky. And the man is rather surprised at this. This book is not even launched yet. So this is it's the first international opportunity I've had for saying anything about it. This book is published by a very small press, and it is being made available on a gift economy basis. Do you want to know the truth? The surprising rewards of climate honesty. In other words, people can pay whatever they want for it, including zero for the ebook, that is. So I hope that many people will take up that offer to read that book for whatever you want, including nothing, if that's all you can afford. And this book, Do You Want to Know the Truth? This book actually features some of the speeches that I gave at and around COP26, including, you very generously mentioned the sense in which I kind of called it when I was inside COP26 last year at Glasgow, and said, firstly, that the COP system is broken. And as I've argued since, that there shouldn't actually be any more COP summits, that they are, at the end of the day, doing more harm than good and giving us the illusion that something is being done. And secondly, that the safe limit for global overheating of 1.5 degrees across the world is going to be broken, that it's not alive, that the elites and also many activists, really, of course, very well-intentioned activists who are desperately trying to keep us below 1.5, that this is now not possible. And over the course of the last year since I said that, a number of other people have been coming on board with that. Most recently, The Economist magazine has said, look, it's just not realistic to stay below 1.5. And I think they are tragically right. And this has enormous consequences in terms of what we need to reassess, because 1.5, it was what our government promised us, that we would stay below that. It was what this whole process was supposed to deliver, staying in that safety zone. And we're not going to stay within that safety zone. And this requires an enormous reassessment. It should liberate a whole lot more in terms of emotions, including but not restricted to anger. And yeah, that's the situation we're in now. It's the whole truth is not being told by most people who are at COP still. There's still a lot of denial, but that is where we actually are. And yeah, that's what my book is about.
Well, let's drill down a little bit. And Tamsin Woolley Barker, an evolutionary anthropologist who's been co-moderating with me for this 10-day program, will join us in a moment. And I'm sure she would love to engage you about the whales and the dolphins as superorganisms, as she calls them.
Yes.
One of the few superorganisms that have a lot to teach us, because that's the inherent potential for humanity as well. But let's sort of start with your initial point, Rupert. How does an event like the flooding of Pakistan, for example, or the massive hurricane that just wiped out Florida, or the heat waves in France and Europe over this past summer, how does that help us? How does that provide an opportunity as we're suffering? People are dying. In Pakistan, there are millions of people and children that are completely homeless to the present day, because these climate disasters hit, but then the governments don't have the wherewithal to either stop it or modulate it or repair it. And so explain more about what you're saying here.
It's a great and fair question, and as I say, I go into full detail on it in Why Climate Breakdown Matters. But let me sketch a little more of the outlines of an answer. So, in terms of these climate disasters, so this year in the UK, we broke through the 40-degree centigrade barrier for the first time this summer, and we broke through it massively. And we were almost 2 degrees higher than the previous maximum record temperature in the UK, which is a real sign of a climate in trouble. Normally records get broken by sort of 0.3 of a degree or something. And 40 degrees for some of you, for example, in the US or other parts of the world, it might not sound a lot, but it's unprecedented in the UK. So we had things like apples on our trees that were being burnt by the sun and turning black in the sun, because these apples have never experienced these temperatures, and they've never experienced this beating sun day after day, which we had this summer. And our infrastructure, etc., it's not designed to cope with these kind of temperatures. So we had a lot of wildfires, for example, on these days that were around 40 degrees. And we're not used to wildfires at all. It was very shocking, and buildings destroyed, all that kind of stuff. But of course, we got off lightly compared, as you say, for example, to Pakistan. A third of Pakistan went underwater. I mean, this is just so terrible and so off the scale. So how can there possibly be anything good about these things? So firstly, the first point to make is obviously these events wake people up, right? Each one of these mega events, a few more people come to the other side of realizing, fuck, it's real, it's deadly, it's getting worse. We have to do something to stop it getting worse, and we have to do something to cope with it as it gets worse. So that's so far so obvious. But there's something much deeper and richer in it as well, which is that what frequently happens, what normally happens in these kinds of disasters, it only doesn't happen typically if misguided governments get in the way of it. What normally happens when these disasters hit is you get loads of people responding in ways that are wonderful and inspiring, generous, altruistic, community-oriented, etc. I talk about this in the book. I talk about, for example, the way this happened around September the 11th in New York in 2001. So I was in New York soon after that terrible day. And I spoke to a friend of mine there from the sort of progressive activist community. And I said, God, it must have just been so awful to have been in New York when the Twin Towers were destroyed and so on. You know, you're terrified, there's toxic ash everywhere. And then you start getting some of this horrible rhetoric from some people from the government around, you know, we're going to get revenge and all this kind of stuff. And he said, you want to know the truth, Rupert? It was the only time in all the years I've lived in New York when I felt like I was part of a community, because people were pulling together. People pulled together in response. The first responders to any real disaster are mostly ordinary people. They're mostly not, you know, the emergency services. They're mostly ordinary people. And he said so many cases of people rushing to one another's aid, of instantly sort of laying on sort of impromptu soup kitchens and first aid and all this sort of stuff, of people talking to each other on the street, talking to strangers, etc. You know, if like me, you've spent quite a lot of time in New York, you'll know that New York is not typically the most friendly place and the most kind of spontaneously supportive and welcoming kind of place and so on. All of that gets turned around when a disaster hits. These climate disasters, they are terrible. They are disasters. They all contain within them the potential for that kind of silver lining. And again, when you look into them, that is what happens. And that is something hugely exciting and important that we need to understand and that we need to operate on the basis of and on the back of. So there's that. And then that connects with the other thing which I dwell on in detail in this part of my book, where I seek to show how these terrible things and these terrible experiences can have a huge upside. The grief that one goes through in relation to a disaster, or more generally, the grief that one experiences, for example, when one simply contemplates the terrible damage that is going on to our Earth. When one contemplates, for example, as you say, Jim, all the species that are on the verge of going extinct, etc. That grief and the anger and the terror, all of these things, they all come from love. We are angry because we want to protect what we love. We feel grief at losing what we love. We feel fear because we want to protect what we love, including ourselves. They all come from love. They're all transmutations of love, and they can be transmuted further into the exact energy that we need in order to start to reform this superorganism and in order to undertake the actions of climate mitigation and transformative adaptation that we so badly need to take. So these difficult emotions that we are inevitably thrown into at this very difficult time in human history, again, they contain absolutely the enormously powerful seeds of the exact transformations that individually and collectively and en masse we need to go through together if we're going to get through this. And it's in that sense, when you think about it, well, actually, just saying it right now, I'm getting chills down my spine. You know, this is fantastic news and enables us to break through the grip that sometimes despair and depression can understandably have when we contemplate with open eyes, as we need to do, exactly where we are. That very contemplation, that very difficult facing of climate reality leads into the very transformations that we need and that are starting to happen.
Yeah, well, I've certainly noted since, say, COP26, a more conscious awareness, particularly in the media, to start saying this is due to climate change.
Yeah.
And before that, it was sort of an invisible, very obvious fact that there was a media government consensus that we don't talk about it. But now at least the media elites are allowing their journalists to talk about it, even if only in kind of general terms. But I'd like to drill down a little deeper in what you're saying, because I think there are two points that I would like to raise.
Yeah.
The first one that was raised, by the Athenian author Thucydides, who pointed out first, as far as we know, about human response in the face of disaster. There was a great plague in Athens around 435 BC, and this was at the height of the golden age of Athens and Periclean Athens. There was a great plague, and he observed that in the face of disaster, the human psyche actually bifurcates. There are some that come to the aid, but there are also some that loot. And you see this in after riots, after hurricanes. It happened in Florida. It happened in France. There's some aspects that will be good Samaritans, and there's some aspects that will be thieves. So I think it's important to point out that there's not a universal response of kind of goodness that happens in the aftermath. And if you take it at a larger level, what happened in the United States in the aftermath of 9/11 is we went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Because
the consternation and the anger was focalized into two major wars in ways that we all know and appreciate. So, I mean, do you wrestle with these issues in the book? Because that complicates the response mechanism.
Yeah, I don't actually wrestle with them a lot in the book. And here's why. We hear a lot about that, and it's really important, right? We a lot of history is talking about that kind of aspect of what happens, people taking advantage of bad situations. You've got Naomi Klein's famous book, The Shock Doctrine, which is about the same kind of thing. What I wanted to do in the book was kind of equalize the balance by talking about the other side more, which is often neglected. I think it's really important for us to realize that there is at least as much of that kind of spontaneously kind of positive human response typically available to disasters as the other response, which we often hear about and is in the news and is in the history books. And I say at least as much advisedly, because I'd go further, and I'd be interested to know if you'd agree or not, Jim. My view is that when one actually looks, and I have looked a fair bit now at some of these disasters in history and climate disasters and so on, when one actually looks at them and studies them and gets beyond the kind of some of the headlines and so on, what one finds is that actually the spontaneous response of most people is the positive response, is the humane response. And that it takes quite a lot of work, and that work often involves propaganda and sometimes involves brute force to displace that response and to turn it into something which is more negative, violent, etc. And of course, the 9/11 situation was a particularly difficult one, right? America had just been attacked with the most the largest ever non-state terrorist action, totally out of the blue. In relation to climate disasters, of course they do have causes in what we've all done, and in particular in what the fossil fuel industry has done, and what the climate denialists have done, and what the horrendous Republican-leaning think tanks have done, and so on. But they are typically experienced in the first instance as simply disasters that afflict people living in a given place, etc. And I would say that they open themselves up, therefore, even more than something that happens in a war or terrorist situation, to liberating this amazing human potential. And I wanted to emphasize that in my chapter in Why Climate Breakdown Matters on this, which draws, among other things, on Rebecca Solnit's remarkable book, The Paradise is Built in Hell, which is about how disasters have this side which we haven't given enough attention to.
Well, it's worth just noting, if you look at the experience of Britain in the Industrial Revolution, or in the 1920s with the muckrakers, as they called them, Sinclair Lewis in his book, The Jungle, where it's, I don't know of any major exceptions, but it's only in the aftermath of a great crisis that social change and social legislation.
That's right. That's another really important point. Yep.
I remember
very important point. And that
Yeah.
again is crucially relevant to our situation, right? We need a lot of those changes now. Some of these disasters may well provide us with the space to start to make those changes.
Yeah. Well, now that Tamsin Willie Barker's with us, who knows a lot about whales and a lot about dolphins as superorganisms, I want to turn to the other point that you were making earlier, Rupert. You used whales and dolphins in your book as an example of what we can learn. So I'd love to have you expound on that for a little bit, and then Tamsin, you jump in and let's go from there.
Yeah. So in the final substantive chapter in the book, I talk about the extraordinary ways in which the social whales and dolphins stick together and support each other, sometimes even to the point of dying with their wounded or stranded or whatever comrades, and argue that there's something extraordinary that we can quite literally learn from this, about what we've lost in trying to turn ourselves into a civilization which prides itself on separation and alleged individualistic difference. And I suggest that spirit of kind of deepen and deep togetherness, the sense that you encounter when you start to learn in detail about the lives of social whales and dolphins, that they have this phenomenal bond, that they have a sense of themselves, it seems, which does not end at the physical limits of their bodies. That this is something that we could be profoundly inspired by, truly learn from, and were we to do so, that would be a further kind of huge tool in our arsenal as we confront the climate and ecological emergency. And calling it a tool in our arsenal is really to understate it. It's really part of the very civilizational transformation that we need, is to go through this kind of transformation of mind and transformation of soul, if you will, that brings us into this space of understanding that this closer than closeness is always already available to us. And many of us have experienced it sometimes in our lives. You may have experienced it in a romantic relationship. You may have experienced it in agitating for social change. I've experienced it, for example, very profoundly in undertaking nonviolent direct action. Sometimes when you're doing nonviolent direct action, when you step outside the law in a just cause, and when you're so completely with the people you're doing it with, that the seeming kind of boundaries between persons really do seem to drop away, and you act like you're part of it's not even a team, you're part of something which is greater than what you normally regard as yourself. And of course, part of the reason why that happens is because you're doing it in service. You're doing it in profound service. So in that sense, you're at those moments, you're part of something which is much, much greater than yourself. You're really part of this ecological community, and you're really part of the human family, and you can perhaps feel it stretching across time into the future, as well as across space. So yeah, that's what I try to, that's really the culmination of the argument in my book, Why Climate Breakdown Matters. And yeah, I would love to know how that resonates with Tamsin, who probably knows a lot more about whales and dolphins than I do.
Thank you, Rupert. That was awesome.
Tamsin.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's even more profound than you've noticed, because we actually we are superorganisms. I mean, that's our natural state, right? Like, we're not like chimpanzees where we just, where our bodies really do end. Our identity ends at our body, but for us, we are superorganisms. So we share, a shared purpose, of water source, an identity, a cultural identity, so it's just like that, taking care of each other.
Yeah, no, I guess what I was trying to say was that I think you're absolutely right, that is completely open to us as human beings, and probably is the state that we were often or generally in at points in our prehistoric and perhaps historic existence. I think that we've lost such a lot of touch or experience with it, that to regain it often feels like a sort of dramatic awakening and something unusual. But ultimately, what we are hopefully trying to build or regain is a situation where it won't seem nearly so unusual.
Right. And I would say that plenty of societies still have it today, when we can just watch how they live and remember that. But I also see you're bringing to my mind the way that we have these global solutions to everything, where really it starts, I think, from that shared identity and purpose, which is kind of, like you said, ecologically shared identity.
Yes.
Tamsin, this would be probably a good time to just summarize what you mean by a superorganism. What is a superorganism, and why are humans, like the whales and the dolphins, why are they superorganisms and the chimpanzees are not? Go into more detail, because I think that's a very profound point that both of you are making.
Yeah. So where chimpanzees and even bonobos, our closest relatives, operate more on dominance, right? Like they want to control more of the reproduction. But humans have not done that. We've actually suppressed that kind of dominance in our, and if you look at foraging people, they do that. And so we're more like an ant or a honeybee society, where we share a territory, we share a home, we protect it, we cultivate it together, because our reproduction really is a collective phenomenon for us. Like lots of us are not breeders in that sense, but we still, or the post-reproductive grandmothers that we have and grandfathers, we have this long thing, and now we share that with the whales. And that's really rare. The orcas and the elephants and us are the only ones that we know of that have that menopause, that extended care for other people's young. So I think of the three diagnostics that come to my mind right away is that most foraging people, 75% of the food they eat is caught by someone else, which is weird. Like the other species don't do that. And then, even like babies, if you divide a plate of cookies unevenly for older children, even a nonverbal baby will look at you with horror. They already know this. They already have it internalized on an instinctive level. And then the third thing is that we share half of our childcare globally with non-related adults. And that's crazy. But the dolphins, whales do that as well. And so I think, we are superorganism mammals, more like a naked mole rats, or, it's something we don't think about too much. And so I think we're always trying to impose this kind of chimpanzee model on ourselves. But really we are more like the whales and dolphins.
But can I say a little word for bonobos?
Yeah.
That I do think it is remarkable how little bonobos are known compared to the other great apes, and they are pretty inspiring compared to the rest of them. I think some things we can learn from them. Sometimes people say to me, "Oh, Rupert, aren't humans kind of really sort of horrible, individualistic, kind of violent creatures like in Planet of the Apes?" And I say, look, the key thing about Planet of the Apes is which apes. And if you imagine a Planet of the Apes film featuring bonobos, basically what it would feature would be totally different. What it would feature would be, there'd be lots of matriarchal power. There'd be lots and lots of sex and love and gift giving and stuff like that. So bonobos might not be quite as inspiring as whales and dolphins, but they're pretty good. They've got quite a lot going for them.
So Rupert, I actually have I make t-shirts, Bonobo Revolution, and so the point of it is that I use it as that we use this distributed leadership, I call it, to how the bonobos, if a male, the males would like to dominate, but they can't, because anytime they do, the females call their friends and they shut it down, and everybody does better. It increases the egalitarianism. So I have the shirts are the collective sisterhood.
Nice.
Me too, call a friend. But I actually think that is the part of the thing that we don't do is we don't maintain our superorganisms. We don't protect each other. We don't protect the common space of our equality in a way. So bonobo revolution.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So let's turn to your other book for a moment, Rupert, that you wrote on do you want to know the truth?
Yeah.
Because you're laying out some powerful points in your first book about the importance of taking these crises as essentially as opportunities.
Yeah.
That if we can see the crisis as an opportunity for a greater altruism, a greater manifestation of love, learning from the whales and the dolphins, we're gonna do what we need to do given the mistakes we've made. I think that's the essential point
that's right.
of your book. So if there's anything else you want to add to that, please do. But let's dive into your second one about do you want to know the truth? Because I think that's part of it. And I'd like to frame it in the following way. It may be that climate change is the first time that humans are not responding to the crises in a constructive way as we've done in the past. It's really quite extraordinary if you think about it. In Chicago, a factory burns down with a bunch of children, and we immediately pass legislation that you can't have children under 18 years old work. Here we have the biggest catastrophe in the history of the human race, and we seem over 50, 60 years to be sleepwalking, ignoring the crisis, refusing to actually label it as the crisis that it is. And thereby we're now in code red, and it may be too late. So your question that you're posing in your second book is in some ways a challenge to your first book. Why is the human race, given Pakistan, given UK, why are we still not doing anything meaningful on climate change? Because it has to do fundamentally with our orientation about truth. So to lay out the thesis of that book.
Yeah, so this is, do you want to know the truth? The surprising rewards of climate honesty. But yeah, I decided to title the book with a question. Because it seems, right, as though some of us, some of the time, or in fact, a lot of us, a lot of the time, don't kind of totally want to know the truth, don't really want to kind of come to terms with it, because that involves pain, and that involves having to change everything, and involves having to act. And part of what I talk about in the book is the way that this is, of course, crazy. I mean, it's crazy not to want to know the truth. And it's the merest essential, albeit difficult, sanity to want to know the truth and to be willing to reconcile with it and to face climate reality and so on. And that's what the book explores. And I explore it by way of the situation in relation to climate over the last couple of years. Including making my critiques of the COP process, which I think has not enabled us to face adequately the truth about how bad things are, nor therefore has it enabled us to really get to grips with what we could and should do about it, either on the international level or on the level of national leadership, or on the level of what we can do locally in our communities, in our workplaces, etc., which is so crucial now because of the extent to which our leaders have failed us. And that failure is really coming home to roost with the fact that it is gradually, painfully coming to light that we are not going to stay below the safe upper limit of 1.5 degrees of global overheat. And that requires us to stop outsourcing to these political leaders and to actually start to step up and take more more responsibility. We have to continue to try to hold them to account. We should continue to vote and so on and so forth. But we should not be under any illusion that doing those things is going to be enough. And we should step into our full power in what we can do through our workplaces, through whatever institutions we are active in, through the geographic communities where we live, to seek to make the future less bad, and to seek to defend ourselves and protect those that we love and ourselves in the very, very difficult and dangerous situation into which we are moving. So that is what the book explores. Along the way, there's a number of surprising moves that I make. For example, one is to question the concept of a climate emergency. So very many of us have been used to this idea of climate emergency as a way of trying to sort of up the ante and get everyone to take the situation fully seriously. But what I point out in this chapter of the book is that what we're in is so much bigger than an emergency. It's so much bigger than that. An emergency is something, an emergency is something you can imagine being put right. An emergency is something that can be brought to an end. An emergency is something where you can leave or get away from it or move on from it. None of these things apply to the situation we are in. This is a new, permanent, tragic, profoundly difficult, profoundly exciting condition that we are inhabiting. And it calls us to face the truth, which is difficult. It calls us to change our civilizational model. That is something that goes far deeper and further than correcting or dealing with an emergency. You know, ultimately, it's a spiritual challenge. It's a philosophical challenge. It's an ethical challenge. Of course, it's a political challenge and economic and technological, but those things do not exhaust it. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm doing in the book, is making some unexpected moves to try to get us to really fully confront where we are, because only if we do so are we going to be able to adequately deal with it. And that includes such difficult things as realizing that this is so much more than an emergency.
Well, let's drill down on that, because this is such a rich material, Rupert. Marcel de Berg just put something in the chat that I think is very interesting, which underscores what you're just saying. He says at its heart, the climate crisis is a social crisis. And that, in his view, at the heart of the social crisis that is making it impossible to deal with the climate crisis is inequality, our social inequality. What would be your comment on what Marcel is bringing in, and what would be your insight as to why climate denialism and the refusal to recognize the truth is now a political ideology on the part of massive amounts of power elites and corporations around the world?
Well, you say around the world, but that's not really true, Jim. They're mostly in the United States.
In the United States.
There's some elsewhere.
I stand corrected.
There's some in Brazil. There's some in Russia. I mean, there are people like that around the world, but there are more in the USA than anywhere else. This, I think, has to do with, again, this kind of extreme cult of individualism and freedom that is present in the United States more than anywhere else. Although, let me point out briefly in passing that this is a kind of cult and an illusion. When you've got everybody saying, I'm an individual, then of course they're all just saying the same thing. This paradox was brilliantly exposed in the magnificent Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, which is really worth looking to on this point. The individualism, the supposed individualism, rugged individualism of the United States and so forth, a lot of it is just an illusion. And in order to really become free, we can't do it without each other. And I think that Tamsin would back that up strongly. Now, having said that, of course, it's absolutely true, as Marcel says, that a key driver of the problem here is inequality, extreme inequality, people attempting to justify inequality. But I don't think it's quite right to say that that is the whole of the problem. there are other aspects to it as well. Now, one that we were touching on a few minutes ago is that part of what this is about is human beings trying to set themselves up above the rest of the world. Now, if you bring about a sense of equality between human beings, as for example, in some forms of socialism or communism, it doesn't necessarily get you any closer to taking seriously our nature as earthlings, to taking other species, other beings seriously, to recognizing their uniqueness, their beauty, their contribution, the fact that we might be able to learn from them, all these kinds of things. So the way I tend to usually describe this is that massive inequality and its ludicrous justification, or pseudo justification, is a huge part of the problem. But there's another part of the problem which is to do with anthropocentrism, placing human beings at the center of everything, when really what we ought to do is place ourselves in the full ecological context, ultimately in the context of being members of this universe. And it seems to me that that is the challenge, to achieve a much more equality between humans, and to take seriously that it's not enough to just think about humans.
Tamsin, what would you say to that?
I would absolutely agree with that, but I would go further, and I think it's maintaining the commons where we're all capable of protecting it for each other. So I think, again, it goes to these global things of like, we're all one species or all one universe. It's like coming back to the local, and who are our relatives in the soil? Who are our relatives in the trees around us? And preserving that commons, that community that we're all in, and maintaining the equality there. And there we have agency. Like there, we can do that right now. You can do that around you. And we know, like if you look at evolutionary theory, that more collaborative groups do better. Selfish individuals do better, but collaborative groups do better. And so if you get a group full of selfish individuals, yes, those individuals will do well, but ultimately those groups, those societies will disappear. So I think, yes, we have a new reality. We have to take care of each other. We have to be self-sufficient. We have to, and that happens on the local level.
Yeah, let's further that in relationship to what Naomi Klein has been writing about in terms of the shock doctrine and so forth, and the inequality is being underscored and deepened because of capitalism, and in particular neoliberal capitalism, so that the climate deniers are, as she points out, they're denying doing anything about the climate because it requires the kind of collective effort, Tamsin, that you just indicated is important, because of this rugged individualism and this ethic of ruthless competitiveness, as we believe that we're more like the primates than the ants, so that there's an ideology that has multiple manifestations in the world. And in the middle of it, you got climate change, which requires us to supersede all the prevailing ideologies that are producing such massive profit and power distribution in an increasingly unequal world. So, Rupert, first, how would you grapple with Naomi's thesis that the root of all this is neoliberal capitalism?
Yeah, so I think what you've just said, Jim, is very plausible, and what Naomi says on this is very plausible. I think there's an interesting question on where we go from there. So, for example, do we go to demonizing capitalists? Seems to me that probably is not nearly as effective as quite a lot of activists would like it to be. Do we go to saying that the problem is markets? Well, again, that seems to me probably going to be misfire, because there are there are many examples in history of where you've had societies which have had markets in them, which have not had the dangerous characteristics of our society. So I think, as you put it, Jim, quite precisely, the problem is capitalism, and specifically the neoliberal form of capitalism, which has come to possess us in recent times. And it is possible to imagine, and more than that, to actually work with some people in businesses who are aware of this and are trying to change this. That's part of what I'm trying to do in the new moderate flank, which has come on a long way since we spoke at COP last year. It's also possible to imagine that in the strange and difficult times we're coming into, there may be kind of syntheses between socialism and capitalism and ecologism. I think that is actually surprisingly credible when one looks deeply, that we may come out of this in some parts of the world with systems that have some of the characteristics of socialism, but some also of capitalism, and that have a kind of a green spine running through them all. So I think the situation is complex, but yeah, I agree with the fundamentals of the diagnosis you outlined there.
Tamsin, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say, evolution has always run that way, where you become more diverse and more exchange grows the possibility space and the abundance, and it's a local phenomenon. So yeah, we got capitalism, and it's so tied to persuasion and selling and manufactured scarcity, right? And then you want to have exclusive control over it, so you have that safety, and I think that's the root of that rugged individualism, is that we don't trust each other. To share when we need it, right? But little communities can insist on that. So I think it's neither communism or socialism or capitalism. I think those are obsolete forms, even forms of economy, and it really comes to the local exchange. But so we can, I think, reinvent capitalism as the opportunity we have to grow these kind of stakeholder capitalism, these local stakeholders where we're working together and we're becoming more unique, and we're really growing the unique potential of the places we live. So I think that's the opportunity that we have.
Well, I think that's right. And I think, that's where I so appreciate the work of Kate Raworth and Donut Economics, because what she's done is rework socialism, capitalism, and economics in totality by saying it's the framework and context that's important. That if you put human flourishing within an ecological context, you make the right decisions naturally, because it's not about self-aggrandizement and greed and profit. It's about how you align human community and human abundance within an ecological order that, if you harmonize with, can increase the abundance and profitability, shall we say, for everyone. That's why I've so supported this notion of donut economics, because I think you're right, Tamsin. What's given the level of the crisis, nothing less than a complete reimagination of economics is in order. Would you agree with that, Rupert, or what would you say?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And look, this reimagination is going to happen. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that either it will happen in something like the way that we hope it happens, and that you've just been hinting at, Jim, or there will be some kind of collapse, or something in between the two. And in my opinion, it's most likely it'll be some kind of mixture between the two. That there may be some parts of the world that get more kind of radically disrupted in the next few decades than others, and also within countries, it could be much more hyperlocal than that. And I think what you're going to see, as one or two people are saying in the chat, and as Tamsin was already indicating, is that there are real possibilities for flourishing local systems that are going to have quite a lot in common with the kind of thing that Kate's been talking about, for example, and trying to start to bring in some places. There are going to be some places which are more like that, and probably other places which are less like that. The more places there are that are the less like that, the more all of us will suffer. Ultimately those places themselves, but also others. And of course, you know, this is where it gets very, very hard, is that the tragic likelihood is that we will all suffer a lot of, well, untold amounts of damage for a long time to come from what's already been done wrong, and what will continue to be done wrong in a lot of places for quite a long time to come. We're not going to get a kind of overnight Schmachtenberger style phase shift, if people know what I'm alluding to there. That just is not the way that the world works, especially a world that is polarized. That, of course, makes it all the more important, by the way, to resist polarization. We cannot achieve a lot of what we need to achieve with society and politics continuing to be as polarized as it currently is, let alone more so. So the new moderate flank I'm seeking to co-create, one of its central objectives is the very difficult objective of trying to overcome polarization and re-establish ourselves in the things we were talking about earlier, our fundamental commonness with each other, what we have in common, which is so much more than what divides us.
Well, let's dive into that vast domain, because you came to wide public attention as a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. And the basic thesis of Extinction Rebellion was that it was time for the people to rise up, engage in highly artful civil disobedience folks did in 2008, that got headlines all over the world. And many people thought this was going to catalyze, you know, massive amounts of protest, civil disobedience, to compel the governments to actually do something. Subsequently, you have now evolved into what you've been calling the moderate flank. And we had a whole dialogue a year ago on the moderate flank as you were writing your first couple of articles and so forth. Tell us about your evolution from 2008 and Extinction Rebellion and being on the streets of London to what you're talking about now with a moderate flank that doesn't want to polarize and so forth and so on. Lay it out, the evolution of the intellectual process.
Well, that's a great invitation. And it's directly relevant, as you say. So in 2018, I helped launch Extinction Rebellion. Immensely proud of that. We achieved a great deal in the UK and around the world. Some of those achievements are still continuing. We did not achieve the kind of transformation in governance and policy that we were aiming at, with a few small exceptions. But we did puncture the complacency of the existing situation. We made, I think, a significant contribution to climate denial no longer being credible in most of the world. We led to a huge upsurge in consciousness around climate and nature. Now, in 2020, I decided to move on from XR, because by then it had become clear to me that although XR, Extinction Rebellion, had been formed with the objective of being widely encompassing and welcoming to grow a huge movement, actually its nature as a radical flank, and it was formed self-consciously as a radical flank to the existing environmental movement, its nature as a radical flank meant that it was inevitably polarizing. And that was part of what we deliberately intended in 2018, 2019. But that has consequences, and you can't carry on polarizing indefinitely. Or to put it another way, there have to be, at the very least, large counterbalancing forces which are not just engaging in activities that are felt as polarizing. And that's what we're trying to create with the new mass moderate flank, which is envisaged as something which is fundamentally distributed, fundamentally kind of welcoming, very low barriers to entry, really, really serious about change, absolutely sticking with the strong diagnosis around the nature of the truth, the nature of the crisis, the more than emergency that we're in. And that's what I talk about towards the end of this book, how the new moderate flank is is fundamentally based in that truth. In fact, if anything, going even further with it, to include the uncomfortable truths around 1.5 being dead, around the necessity to transformatively adapt, around the tragic fact that the demands of Extinction Rebellion have not been met, and therefore around the fact that we have to keep changing up and reimagining what we do. So yeah, that's why I've now founded this organization called the Moderate Flank Incubator. We've got a few $100,000 of initial funding. We're based primarily in the UK, although we're liaising across various other countries already, trying to produce, again, sort of a bit like with XR, proof of concept in the UK. We're focusing a lot on community climate action, on transformation in workplaces, especially those kind of areas like the professions, some of the professions where there is huge scope for change and leverage. I'm talking about things like the law, audit, insurance. And we're also working to some extent with like-minded businesses. And it's kind of happening, you know, a lot has happened since the last year. We're going to be formally launching in a couple of weeks' time. And yeah, so you'll be hearing more of us, but we've already been getting into the media some and so forth even before we launched. I'll put a few links in the chat around that in a moment. It's exciting. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you, Jim? Does that make sense to you, Tamsin? What do you think?
Well, Tamsin just put in the term radical centrism. I'm wondering, Tamsin, whether that means the moderate flank, or do you have something different in mind?
No, I think it does. It's, you know, we're all human and we're all in this. And so we all have different perspectives and ways of approaching it. And I think that's fine. And I think it's mostly about agency, inspiring agency in your life. And we're so exhausted, you know, most of us are extracted. We're in the machine, right? We don't have a lot of time and energy left over to do this. So it has to be integrated in our lives. And so I think we have an abundant opportunity to kind of create this ghost, I think of it as a ghost scaffolding that's within organizations and within the institutions we have. That's, you know, just based on you and a friend and then maybe third person and going to work. So I think that what you're talking about, if I've got that right, is this cellular kind of structure within the institution, so that we can actually adapt. You know, this blobby global thing, we can't actually make any change. So I think you're dead on. Great.
Yeah. In response to Matthew in the chat, who says it should be about mostly citizen political participation. Well, that's one aspect, but I guess what we think is that the political process as it stands is not enough, and we're not going to be able to make it enough without a kind of cultural change, really. That's what it ultimately boils down to. Without giving people more of a kind of hands-on sense of agency, and without shifting the sense of kind of what's important as well as what's possible, such that politics starts to respond to businesses, institutions, localities that are modeling what needs to happen, and therefore starting to demand change that fits with what they're trying to model and what they're trying to bring into existence.
Yeah, I think this is a very fertile conversation, because I think to some degree, Rupert, your transition from Extinction Rebellion to the moderate flank is also a personal maturation and growth. And, you know, as I think back on my life, for example, in my younger years, I was on the front lines, running around with a knife between my teeth, organizing civil disobedience, taking over administration buildings at Harvard, you know, laying siege to the Pentagon, getting myself arrested multiple times on an Extinction Rebellion model. And as I look back on it, I realized that it was as much a function of my own rage and my own desperation that I really literally had no choice but to put myself out in the streets and in front of the bulldozers and risk being shot by the police, as I was in Oklahoma when we shut down the Black Fox nuclear reactor. But here I am today on Humanity Rising, right? And because I, as I've matured, I've come to see that, I think as you have, and I no doubt you, Tamsin, that really Einstein was right, that the consciousness that produces the problem can't change the problem. So that there's as much utility in seeking to change consciousness as there is to being directly, physically confrontational around the evil that you seek to either expose or to eradicate. So I would bring that in, because I think, just like, Gandhi's nonviolence and Mandela's use of armed struggle is really a continuum of social change that we need to honor, given circumstance, given personalities, and given objectives. So I want to make sure that we're not negating direct action.
Absolutely.
Even though we are on Humanity Rising, right? It's another form of direct action. So this is very nuanced and layered.
Yes.
Wouldn't you both agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I would say to those who've never undertaken any nonviolent direct action or civil disobedience, you're missing out. I wouldn't have missed it for the world, and I wouldn't be surprised if I do it again in the future. But one has to always think, what is not just kind of what do I want to do, or what do I feel comfortable with, or what sort of feels like it works for me, or what kind of comes naturally from my gut or from my mind even. You also have to ask questions like, what right now is the gap in the ecosystem, as it were, that most needs to be filled? What do people most need to be doing right now? And I think that there is huge potential for action in local communities, in workplaces, in professions, etc. That would be really serious, really truth-based. That would be just what we need to take advantage of some of the raising of consciousness that groups like XR caused over the last few years. We need to take advantage of that. We need to make it real on the ground in ways that our so-called leaders are not doing. And that is a hugely exciting prospect. In that sense, again, it is a kind of direct action, if you will. And just one more thing I would say, we have to be very careful if we go down this kind of moderate flank path, that we're not just doing something which kind of actually is easier because it feels safer, because we're less likely to get beaten up or arrested or anything like that, right? We really have to be careful that the reasons we're doing it, if we're doing it, is because it is actually the best thing for us right now to be doing, all things considered. And so I invite everyone to kind of check themselves out in that sense, to run through the thing. Am I doing this or not doing this because I'm scared, or am I doing it or not doing it because it's what I'm called to, and what actually is the most important thing that I can contribute to along with other people right now? That's what it needs to be.
Yeah, very good point, Rupert. Very good point. It's not my own comfortability, is what does the situation demand of me at this moment? And that's the Rosa Parks, and I would add, those are these young women right now in Iran. You have this extraordinary phenomenon in Iran, in the face of probably one of the most coercive regimes in the world, of young women, Gen Zs, teenagers, that are taking off their hijab in a form of direct action. Scores have been shot, scores more have been jailed, and it's been an awful situation. And yet they've ignited a revolutionary movement that Iran hasn't seen since 1979 and the Islamic overthrow of the Shah. So the point that you're making is really critical, everyone. It's about timing, and it's about context, and it's about, as you've said several times, Tamsin, it's about agency. What can I do in this moment to have a certain effect that is aligned with my own capacities, but also what that situation, as I said, demands of me. So this is a very important point. Tamsin, what would you say about that?
Well, I was just going to agree because I did Earth First when I was, in my teens, and
Me too.
yeah, but when they're coming for the tree with a bulldozer, you have to act to save your body, right? That's part of your body. That's part of your, and so then you're very active in that way. But as I've matured, I've thought, like, what can I do that's more systemic? What can I do that's a higher leverage point than just this one tree or this one forest? And so it's been, writing a book, creativity. What can I do that inspires people, inspires a consciousness shift, and actually gives people agency? So I think both need to be happening all the time, because some people, that's all they can do is protect their autonomy, their bodily autonomy. So absolutely, it's context and capacity.
Yeah. And women all over the United States right now, for example, are dealing with this because the government is saying you don't have control of your bodies anymore. And young women, teenagers that never were political for a moment in their lives are now being thrust into a political context where their decisions, their agency is going to be consequential one way or another, depending on where they live.
Right. And we saw that in the 60s and 70s too, with the Vietnam War. It's when someone puts your body on the line, you suddenly, you have to take a stand.
Yeah. So as we conclude, Rupert, I'd like to return to this question of truth. Cuff Ferguson just put in the chat, he's written an article called The Politics of Truth. And I think the point that you're raising around our orientation to truth is actually a fundamental one.
Yes.
We know that the truth will set us free, as Jesus said 2,000 years ago. And yet, in our daily lives, you've read studies, we lie like 15 or 20 times a day when we don't tell people the truth. We don't orient ourselves to the truth personally.
Yeah.
The mass media doesn't give us the truth. And yet you're calling upon us to tell the truth in a world that's conspiring against the truth. So I'd like to have that beautiful mind of yours kind of parse out what is truth telling? What is the truth in a world of disguise?
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, it's been a watchword of my whole life to really try to tell the truth and stay honest, even when it's hard. And of course, I haven't always done it, but I do think I probably do it more than the average person. And I think it's worth trying to do that. Among other things, I'm a Quaker, and the Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends, put a very, very strong emphasis on truth-telling, on fundamental honesty. For example, one of the interesting ways in which that has played out historically is that Quakers refuse to swear on the Bible. And people say, well, why you're Christians, right? Why won't you swear on the Bible? And the Quaker answer is, look, if I swear on the Bible and to promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, I'm kind of implying that maybe most of the rest of the time I just, bullshit or lie or whatever, and I don't, and that's not okay. So we shouldn't need to swear on things. People should be able to just take our word all the time. And that, of course, relates to, fundamentally to the wonderful stuff Tamsin's been discussing about how it's possible to have a superorganism and how a kind of fundamental trust needs to be and is, at least in potential, present in humanity. And that's what humanity can rise into, right? So in terms of where this sits in the politics of the world today, and in specific relation to the overarching template of the climate crisis, on the one hand, we've seen the rise of politicians like Trump, who pride themselves almost on their lies, manipulation, and bullshit, and that's extremely disturbing and distressing. And we've seen the weaponization of untruth on social media and so forth. But on the other hand, people, and partly for that exact reason, people are really hungry for the truth and for truthfulness. And this is the deep secret of the surprising, because to most people it was completely surprising, success of Extinction Rebellion and of the school climate strike movement, that people could see, they could tell that in what we were saying and what we were offering, myself and the other people who launched XR and Greta Thunberg and so on and so forth, was not turning away from the difficult truth about how deadly the climate situation has become, was offering ourselves as authentic human beings who were prepared to show up, warts and all, including very much with an emotional presentation, not trying to hide behind facts, not trying to hide behind a cold sort of rational approach, as scientists, for example, are usually taught to hide behind. But giving something much more direct than that, that's the secret of a lot of the success in the media, for example, of XR, of Greta. What is essential now is that we carry that on, as I said before, that we actually radicalize it, if you will, take it even further into dealing with incredibly uncomfortable truths, like the fact that our demands have not been met, like the fact that it's too late for 1.5 degrees, like the fact that we have to adapt as well as mitigate and prevent now, to go deep into those things. And in the way that we talked about an hour ago now, that can actually rocket fuel us, that can actually power us with our full potential with each other as human beings, with the incredible power of, for example, a mother's love or an uncle's love, with the incredible kind of richness and energy that is our grief and our mutual trust and our love and all of these things interwoven. So that's really those are really the stakes, and truth is the foundation of it, and truthfulness runs through all of it. And without that, we don't have anything. But with it, it's possible to do things that seem impossible. There are many things that it is too late for, and there are many things it is not too late for. And some things that it seems too late for, it may even turn out that it's not too late for them, because extraordinary things become possible when we live in and launch from the truth. And that's what I would so strongly say to everyone who's stuck with us throughout this broadcast, that each and every one of us is capable of far more than we think if we sync with this power, with this deeper reality, and that is what we are called to do. That is what we are called to do in small ways and large at this moment in history.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. I'm mindful, everyone, that as Rupert's been speaking, so has Joe Biden in Sharm El Sheikh, and I would offer that our conversation has been much more interesting, because it's been closer to the truth of what we need to encounter in ourselves and the environment, and about what we need to do collectively, as Tamsin's been telling us since Monday, as a superorganism. That's the opportunity inherent in our current crisis, I believe. And so, Rupert, Tamsin, thank you both so much for a very rich and textured conversation today. I wish the whole world could have heard it.
Yeah. Well, let's do our best to ensure that happens, and we'll get the recording shared and everything. Tamsin, such a pleasure to meet you. Really, really impressed. And I felt like the three of us were well, it was a meeting of minds. It was a mini superorganism in the making.
Redwood Summer.
What's that?
Redwood Summer.
Yes. Were you there?
I was.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah, 1990. Yeah.
Wow, I wonder if we literally, were sitting around the same fire or something at some point 32 years ago.
I was a lot younger then, so.
Me too, funnily enough.
We all were. Well, thank you both. And that does it for us for today, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat that Stan put out. And then enjoy your weekend. And then we come back on Monday for another 5-day program as we continue our reporting from Sharm El Sheikh. We'll be hearing from more youth. We'll be talking about business innovations that are offering incredible breakthroughs in terms of the climate situation. And we're going to be culminating on a discussion of shadow in our psyches and how we can transmute those things that we want to deny, but when confronted with the truth, can change the very nature of our personalities and our souls. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Tamsin.